All the way back at episode 15, I did a podcast entitled What's in a Lie, in which I did a sort of little review of the unknowable consequences and degrees to which things can go very badly quickly from even just small lies of expedience. And the conclusion of that is to let in as few of those as possible into your own life. And today I kind of want to extend that a little bit by casting a ruler across kind of our civilizational level ideals and seeing where there are identifiable lies against revealed behavior, which might sound like quite an abstract project, but I guess in some ways it is. But the reason I'm coming to it is from not an abstract value at all, which is, I guess, a healthy concern for civilizational level trends. And to what degree can we tie those back to lies that we tell ourselves? And to what degree can we identify lies that are used to execute and then maintain the worst excesses of our civilization, in the sense that we undertake behaviors that, if run out across a long enough period of time, will inevitably lead to some pretty big self-harm and probably collapse. And if it isn't already obvious, this stuff is on my mind because of the wars that we have in the world at the moment. And not just the existence of those wars, but how they've been brought about and the volatility that they invite, which is something I've talked about a bit in the podcast, looking at the Iran war, the Epstein files, and then Venezuelan operation before that. And to reiterate, it is my assessment that those things are not even your run-of-the-mill bad quality wars. I think they're symptomatic of something far larger. And if you're interested in a bit of my thoughts on that, I will be doing an episode for my patrons only on an update assessment of the Iranian catastrophe. I named the episode very intentionally for the outbreak of that war catastrophe, and I was a hair away from calling it fucking catastrophe, but I didn't want to sound melodramatic. But even still, I regret not doing it because I think that it warrants the use of a swear word or two, because it really is, as they say, a quagmire. Anyway, I go into more of that this week when I release an episode for my patrons. If you're curious on hearing that stuff and all the other extra content, head on over to patreon.com/Endry. And thank you if you are already a member. But yes, rather than get sucked too much into the context of that specific example today, I want to look at where there's a gap between values and behavior. That's something I've always been interested in. And I'll do that by casting a ruler across both the personal proclivity that we all have to inevitably have a gap between our stated values and the revealed preferences of our behavior. But I think that there's a bigger story in some of the largest values that we tell ourselves that we collectively hold as a society and civilizational level that are across the arc of time kind of exposed, where our revealed preference behavior indicates that these values and ideals are kind of empty pillars, which can only have consequences one way or the other. I'm feeling a little bit vulnerable about talking about it because it's going to bring up a few sacred cows for things that perhaps most of us don't spend any time questioning, like the value of rights, the value of life, the value of equality, and I guess many of the other big ones that are the sort of fundamental values that underpin our societies. And yeah, I'm interested to see where this exploration goes. So thanks so much for joining me, and let's get straight into it. If you're even a casual student of history, you'll inevitably come across things that have occurred in the past that are kind of shocking and unrelatable. I always reflect that even the life of somebody in the 70s who is sort of equivalent to me in basically every other way would be as foreign to me as today, but being dropped into an alien culture somewhere else on the planet. A lot of really interesting things are a lot more malleable than we might think. And one of the interesting ways of measuring those differences is just seeing that, well, and sorry to pick a hyper stylized example, but if you're an Aztec and you're happy to sacrifice 50,000 children so that you get a good harvest, then obviously you value the harvest more than the lives of children, which is something that is kind of hard to relate to at a material level today. But there are any number of more subtle examples that you can give. And it leads to people prosecuting cases across history to say X was a good or bad person. But of course, the moral framework that they lived within is entirely alien for us. And so it's not a particularly useful endeavor often. All of which is to say that the values that we assume are universal are usually demonstrably not. You can normally find another point in human society where the ethical codes and even just the internally felt sense of morality of what's right and wrong can sit within wider parameters than perhaps we instinctively feel or would like to feel day to day. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't values that transcend time and there aren't things that tend to feel good or bad to us that are universal. And that's an interesting topic to go into. That's a bit off the plate of what I want to talk about today. Today, I want to talk about how we react when we find situations where our own values are discordant with our behavior, and then what the consequences of those various courses of behavior could be. And then zoom back and see, well, are there instances of those shifting values and malleable values and perhaps lies at a large scale that we would be well served to interrogate and do without? Because, as I alluded to in the intro, it's my assessment that there are a lot of these sort of civilizational level holes at the moment where we are comfortable enough sitting on a tower of enough lies to feel that we can act with impunity to kind of do the worst types of things that people do. And that ultimately becomes a revealed preference where, to an outside observer, if you were looking at a gap between someone's values and their behavior, you're going to default to the behavior as the proof. I mean, I can be one of those televangelists who talks about the importance of the sanctity of marriage all day long on TV, and then I'm caught having sex with every single person that I can. And you would look at me and think, well, that guy does value marriage. He's just not very good at it. No, probably more likely you think, well, that guy's bullshitting when he talks on TV and as just a ruse to gain more power to whatever. So in the same way, I'm going to cast that lens across the social level. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. First, I want to talk about us as individuals. So I want you to think about a time where you have had a value that you identified with yourself strongly and then realized that you were being hypocritical in how you behaved in reality. And don't be too hard on yourself about it because it's something that everybody does. I think that it's a part of growing up. In fact, I often think of my past versions of myself and like feel ashamed or cringe or whatever. But I think that if you look back and don't feel those things, then you're probably not developing at all. So if you can identify one of those moments for yourself, whether it's something you came to yourself or somebody else pointed out the hypocrisy of how you were behaving versus what your stated values were, you kind of, as far as I can tell, when you're in that situation, you kind of have three options. Firstly, and this is the easiest one, so I guess it's pretty common, you can just dismiss it. And continue to have the cognitive dissonance where you're happy to behave in one way and believe yourself to be the type of person who behaves another. But sometimes there are situations where you just can't continue down whatever road it is you are in life and by holding on to a lie. So you have to let it go, or you have the energy or time or support to proactively confront whatever it is that you're having this duality about. And that is your second option, which is you update your behavior. One you see with a lot of young men is that, particularly because of how we're socialized in progressive Australia now, is to have the sense of being a strong feminist or caring a lot about being a good partner or a nice person or whatever. And then when inevitably something comes up that reveals that you are not that or not behaving in that way, then that might prompt you to correct your behavior and to adjust. In fact, it's often kind of, maybe it's a stereotypical observation now, but it's often the case that people who are out loud very strongly in one value set will be in their personal lives poorly behaved by the defined values of that projection. I think there's a correlation there. In the same way that it's always the most ardent conservative Republican Bible-holding extremists who are ashamed of being closeted homosexuals, or it's the NGO that turns up to fight for workers' rights that is inevitably making all of their employees do 100-hour weeks under no managerial support or workplace conditions. Something about a cognitive dissonance where identifying as having a particular value can often just give you just enough shade to not have to interrogate your own behavior. But that's going a bit off piece for now. So that's your second option. You can identify that there's a inconsistency there and update your behavior with your stated values. And as far as I can see, the third option you have is to update your value, which is also a hard one, particularly if you have been public or built some sense of identity off of whatever your stated values are. It can be very hard to backtrack that because people will see you as a hypocrite, and people, for whatever reason, hate hypocrites above bad actors in many instances. Betraying a tribe is a more expensive thing to do socially, I think, than to acknowledge that you've done something badly by the rules of that tribe. That's not universal, but it's common enough. And I think if we were to all put ourselves in the hot seat, it's probably the case that all of us listening now are operating under some presumed values set or even earned values set in a way that's totally inconsistent with our behavior. And I think it's worth looking at that behavior as the revealed preference and then thinking how we want to respond to that situation. And it can be tough and ugly because I don't dare to suggest that there is a correct way to respond to those inconsistencies. Say, for example, if you see yourself as an ardent environmentalist and you care about the planet a lot, and then you realize, oh, I also really happen to like shark fin soup and I'm eating shark fins like there's no tomorrow. Yeah, on that metric of the three options that you have, I mean, you can carry on eating the shark fin soup and proclaim across it how much you love the sharks and want to save the ocean. That's a bit ugly, so I wouldn't recommend that one. Then your other options are, well, I'm going to stop eating shark fins, but unfortunately you love them so much. So third option, maybe you adjust your value down a bit and like, you know what? Maybe I don't care about the ocean as much as I proclaimed and I'm pretty happy to eat the sharks. So there's not one fin left in the ocean. Now, it's a bit lazy of me to pick a facetious example because there are so many real ones to hand, but I kind of want to leave that to you and not make judgment calls about whatever your values are that you think may have a big glaring gap with your behavior if you're to run that meter of your life. But I do suggest that it's worth it because those inconsistencies do represent a kind of engine failure where you're not going to be able to get to exactly where you think that you're going or where you may wish to be, or you're going to stumble across pitfalls that you don't see, or find yourself in environments that don't suit you, or find yourself in escalating situations that are alienating to you, much in the same way as my conclusions were from the lying episode, because they kind of are. I mean, I don't want to attribute undue harshness to it because, as I said, it's something that literally all of us have, these inconsistencies to different levels. But they do represent lies and they will inevitably have consequence as you play them out across your life. And the earlier you can get onto them, the better. Even if they're very painful to address today, they will still be less painful than addressing in a year or 10 years or 20 years or not addressing them at all and never getting to where you may wish to go. And again, full sympathy for having those because, you know, nobody has the cognitive bandwidth to interrogate all of their actions or all of the consequences of their beliefs or all the consequences of everything around them. And we as a collective get to know more and more things all the time. So, you know, we should minimize the social cost for making those adjustments truthfully. And also, I mean, I haven't looked into the literature on this, but I'm sure the best predictor for the values that we hold and the beliefs that we have about how the world works is the society that we live in and the households that we grow up in and the communities around us, et cetera, et cetera. So no shame in not being born into the perfect, complete environment because nobody has been. And because we most tend to cluster around some sort of ideology based on what feels good for us, based on our personal proclivities, there will inevitably be clustering of ideas that are totally hypocritical and demand being unpicked at the individual level. To give one very obvious consequence of this, I mean, sorry to pick on environmentalists so much, but it's quite possible that the Greens in Germany will have been responsible for one of the worst environmental outcomes in Europe in this century, which is the great intention of shutting down nuclear plants to replace them with renewable energy that was done under a Greens coalition led by Greens policies in the last decade. Hasn't been able to be achieved at all. And so instead, that large engine house of European economies is pivoting hard back to fossil fuels. And what's more, they're doing it at a time now where there's all these crises surrounding the cost and sourcing of that. So for the blind spot of having an ultimate perceived good that was not fully interrogated against reality, there's now an observable consequence that is the antithesis of what they were hoping to achieve, in that they've ended up increasing their dependence on oil and gas, and they're even reactivating existing coal plants. So that's one small, albeit large, example of a blind spot represented at scale. And the blind spot is, I care most about the natural world, because if you make that declaration, you don't interrogate it, then you can think, well, me, who cares most about the natural world, is going to be against nuclear energy because there are some negative consequences for the environment associated with nuclear energy. So I should do everything to deal with that. And my behavior is pure and good. And whoops, I've accidentally reopened some old coal mines and not been able to achieve something that was predictable from the start. Now, to pick on the right wing in equivalent way, I guess a big lie from the Trump campaign was that they were going to reduce the debt. They're fiscally conservative people who are responsible economic managers, et cetera, et cetera. And so everybody who votes for that is happy to miss the blind spot that there's a whole bunch of billionaires associated with contributing to the campaign and candidates themselves and members of the administration. And those billionaires, turns out they have financial interests, and turns out their donors have financial interests, and those align in this instance with a larger government. And guess what? They end up passing the largest budgetary increases ever, including $1 trillion for the Pentagons. Maybe I'm too harsh to pick on individual voters for that because it's kind of unknowable what you do in advance. But I think at least in retrospect, you have to acknowledge, if you were one of those people who supported that it was not successful and was probably never going to be successful. But even those bigger examples are really small against the kind of presumed values, or at least restated values, that our civilizations rest on. And I'm talking about ones that are kind of the water all around us that we assume to be true. But if you scratch at the surface, or if you look at current events in particular, you can see that in many instances, not only are they much weaker than we thought, but possibly don't exist at all. And there are so many to go into that would deserve hours of deconstruction each, and expert commentary, and I suppose and full PhDs and books and lecture series is about. And obviously, I'm not going to do that in the last 10 minutes of this episode, but just to skid across a surface level example. If you were to imagine a political debate between the leaders and the opposition of whatever country you're living in, it would be very unlikely that they would argue with each other against things like the right to life, the value of an international order, the value of democracy, the value of freedom of speech, the value of having transparent institutions, the value of stamping out corruption, the value of meritocracy, the value of protecting people's rights to privacy, or the value to a plurality of expression. And yet all of those have strong counter that demonstrate that there's not only not bipartisan universal support, there's bipartisan opposition to those in how we act. I mean, even to pick the concept of justice, you're never going to find a thought leader or a political candidate campaigning on the idea that justice shouldn't exist or is not a good thing. And yet, by the revealed standards of what's happened in response to the obvious crime divulged from the Epstein files, there hasn't been a single charge laid in America. And even in the UK, we think of Prince Andrew and Mandelson as having been charged because they were arrested for 10 hours each. Neither of them have been charged with anything at the moment. So again, sorry, I'm being sucked into specific examples, but there are illustrations across the gamut of how kind of most of the values that the definitive self-identifying ones of Western civilization and civilization as a trend in general are ones that are repeatedly not only skirted or avoided when inconvenient, but actively hammered in a way that's so discordant with the general discourse and trends of how we discuss society that if you'd said to me at an 18-year-old that by the time I'm 40, there'll be knowing genocides, wars of aggression, sexual crimes, mass corruption, uniform anti-democratic behavior, universal violation of privacy, hyper-concentration of wealth, and failure to rein in any of these very unpopular trends via the ballot box or via even the political candidates who are against these things, I would have been shocked. I would have assumed that the opposite would be true in every single one of those. And I think it's at a point where it's not cynical to identify these divergences as inevitable expressions of humanity. I think it's at the point where they're kind of the aggregate of so many lies that buying into the lies that these things exist, and particularly democracy. That's one I've talked about a lot on the podcast. But continue to repeat and state these narratives, like we have freedom of speech when, last week a girl was arrested for wearing a T-shirt with a slogan on it. Much like the NGO that proclaims to care about workers' rights while exploiting their workers, it's providing the very cover and shade that we need to fail to address those issues. And furthermore, it's also failing to spread the gospel of the general good that those ideals hold, because people from the outside who don't have them will see the greatest proponents of justice and democracy and rights of the individual and freedom of speech, such as the US, go blow up 170 whatever schoolgirls in Iran and think, well, actually, maybe all of those things aren't good. And it turns out they're all lies and you can't have them anyway, which is a terrible reputational cost for what are very, very good ideas and very, very important things that are worth striving towards. And I find it really tough to talk about this stuff so much in the podcast because, as I've said before, I am an optimistic person and I consider myself hopeful about the future. And I think my behavior, my own revealed preference in how I'm building life would back that up. But it's very hard to take an objective look at the merging of so many world trends at the moment and to not talk about them for what they are. Because just as the individual who lies to themselves about something important and hopes to continue navigating the world without some sort of comeuppance is likely doomed in one sense, the more that we construct our societies upon the narratives of these lies, upon the false narratives of these values that are stated and wielded against the revealed preference of how we behave, I think the more inevitable it is that there'll be some correction at some point or some catastrophe that we just can't deal with. that will have a great and avoidable consequence. And I think there are so many spot fires that you could look at the moment and think, well, in 10 years, that's going to be a tipping point problem, whether it be economic inequality in the US, whether it be the spiraling conflicts and blowback of violence in the Middle East, whether it be the near total failure of Western societies to deal with the various housing crises that they have and the so-called democratic mechanisms that are not representing the interests of the citizens there, whether it be treating the environment with total impunity and expecting to be able to continually extract based on those trends forever without consequence, or whether it be the tech panopticon that's sort of silently lowering and clicking into place around us with an increased dependency and end of privacy to the degree that the type of blackmail that Epstein would seek on particular people is something that they don't even need to build anymore because it's just available universally for whatever hidden state and non-state actors to wield as they will upon all of us. It's it's hard to see these things and to think that they won't come with some sort of consequence. And I think the failure to deal with those in a large part is coming from, well, I mean, it's coming from the weight of the power of those who have an interest in these things occurring and accelerating. But it's something that we also have a responsibility to reject by not buying into the language of the idea that we do have freedom of speech, or that we do have right to privacy, or that we do have just systems, or we do have meritocracies, or all these things. Which is not to say that we shouldn't want those and we should just be in despair. Like, they're worth actively agitating for. But there's something in that civilisational gap that there's a very important role that we play to not continue to feed that cognitive dissonance of seeing where there's a gap between the stated values, say, for example, freedom of speech, and the revealed behaviour, arresting somebody for a T-shirt. Or I think in the UK, they've had some 10,000 arrests in the last few years for people doing posts on social media. So yes, taking all these things and then running them through the prism of the first three responses that you can have at an individual level that I stated at the top. The first one being to ignore it and to continue with the cognitive dissonance. And I think that is the default position for almost all of us at the moment in response to the scale of these things, and one that I'm encouraging us, at least in this audience, to have a shift on. 2, seeking a correction, which is hard because there's so many and they're so big at the unit level, we're not so powerful. Or 3, adjusting the value. And I think, just as at the individual level, I wouldn't want to say a blanket best practice for responding to these inconsistencies. But I think if it is the case that we're feeling that those values are important to us, that we at least don't opt to the first one of simultaneously allowing us collectively to get away with the sense that we do value life, and then watch our state contribute to a war just on civilians, or watch our state profess to hold the rule of law as a value and then disregard actors that it likes breaking the law, and then punish those that it doesn't like who aren't breaking the law. Because these civilizational foundations really matter, and it's worth getting them right. And where we get them wrong and they decay and they lose all their legitimacy because they're not real, it eventually rots and creates a vacuum for things that collapse, and who knows what's going to replace them. But normally when societies have radical shifts, they slip into extreme violence and chaos, and all the well-intentioned people in the world don't seem to be able to prevent that, or prevent some sort of strong version of the same violence-based order re-emerging. So those are my thoughts for you this week. I'm going to come back next week with a positive modelling for what I think are some responses to these world situations and these divergences in values, not only just in how you live in your personal life, but how you may think of the future and the skills you may want to build for yourself and the people you care about. And I hope that will be an interesting thing for you to reflect on in this next week. If you do share my assessment of these things, or even if you don't, I would love to hear that. Tell me where I'm wrong, and tell me where you think there's a genuine cause for celebration of these values, and where you may feel that even just the expression of them without necessarily following through, because we're all flawed anyway, is its own good and superior to the alternative. Those valid thoughts. I'd love to hear it. If you've got thoughts, please take to the comments in discussion. Wherever I do get a conversation going, normally it's YouTube is the most dynamic spot for these discussions. But wherever it is that you are listening, thanks so much for joining me. Please throw the like, follow, subscribe, share, all those things, because it makes it all grow. And I appreciate it very much. I appreciate most of all my Patreon patrons. Thank you for your ongoing support. If you want to have a say in episodes that come up or get access to the extra content, there's an Iranian episode this week. Please head on over to patreon.com/Endrey, ENDREY. There's a free tier, but if you can contribute, it helps me to do these better and better all the time, and sends the signal that you value it too, which I really appreciate. Okay, have a wonderful week, and I'll be back with you with some hopeful messaging next week. I'm excited to get into it.